You wake up, it's 3:17 in the morning, the room is wrong. Not wrong in a way you can explain to anyone the next morning, not wrong in a way that survives the daylight, but wrong in a way that sits behind your sternum for weeks. You don't remember falling back asleep, you don't remember anything after the light, and when you pull back your sleeve, there it is, a bruise, a mark, a small circular impression that wasn't there when you went to bed. Millions of people have reported this, across every continent, across every culture, across centuries. The question isn't whether something is happening. The question is what. I want to start with a number. 62,000. That is, conservatively, the number of documented cases in the academic literature, survey data, and medical records of people reporting what researchers have come to call anomalous nocturnal experiences. Experiences involving paralysis, missing time, physical marks, and the consistent, unnervingly consistent, presence of described entities that look a particular way. Grey skin, large black eyes, small, slight bodies, no more than 4 feet tall, and a silence, always a silence, that the witnesses describe not as the absence of sound, but as something pressed into the room like a physical weight. I'm a journalist. I've covered wars, I've covered fraud, I've covered pharmaceutical cover-ups and government whistleblowers. I went into this investigation fully expecting to spend 3 weeks and come out the other side with a story about sleep paralysis and mass hysteria. What I found instead was something I'm still, 2 years later, trying to fully account for. Because the deeper I looked, the less the comfortable explanations held. Let me take you through 10 signs, not anecdotes, not fringe internet folklore. 10 documented, repeating, cross-cultural, cross-era patterns that appear in the testimony of people who have never met each other, who have never shared their stories, who in many cases didn't even know others had experienced the same thing. And each one, taken alone, is dismissible. But together they describe something that refuses to be dismissed. Let's start with the one that gets laughed at most. Waking at 3 in the morning, specifically 3 a.m., not 2 a.m., not 4:30, not some vague middle of the night hour, but 3 a.m., or within a narrow window around it, with a consistency that has been documented across thousands of reported cases. Dr. David Jacobs, historian and professor emeritus at Temple University, spent over 25 years conducting hypnotic regression interviews with individuals reporting anomalous nocturnal contact. His case files, housed at the Alien Abduction Archive and analysed independently by several researchers, show a disproportionate clustering of reported onset times between 2:47 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. Why would that be? The sleep medicine explanation says this is simply the period of deepest REM cycle, the point at which the brain is most active and most susceptible to vivid hallucinatory experience. That's a reasonable answer. I sat with it for a while, and then I read the Roper poll, the 1992 Roper Organization survey, not a fringe publication, not a YouTube channel, but one of the most respected polling firms in American political history. Surveyed nearly 6,000 adults and found that approximately 2% reported waking regularly at this specific hour, with the distinct impression that something in the room had changed. 2%. Of the adult population of the United States alone, that is approximately 4 million people. 4 million people waking at the same hour, all describing the same wrongness in the room. This raises a simple but critical question. If this is purely neurological, purely a function of universal sleep architecture, why does the wrongness go away when the hour passes? Why do these same individuals, in case after documented case, show no similar pattern of waking at 3 a.m. in the months before or after the central incident? The pattern appears, it repeats, and then for many of them it stops, not gradually, abruptly. I want to be careful here because this is where the conversation most easily slides into the lurid and sensational. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the physical evidence, specifically what it is and what it is not. The marks appear in 3 primary configurations documented across independent case files from Brazil, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the American Midwest. First, small circular bruises, usually in clusters of 3, arranged in a triangular or linear pattern, most commonly on the upper arm, the calf, or the lower back. Second, elongated scratches parallel, evenly spaced, too regular to suggest a common domestic cause, found on the torso, the neck, or the inner thigh. Third, and the strangest, a small puncture wound, usually singular, at a location that makes self-infliction anatomically improbable. Brazilian researcher Dr. Lear, who spent decades cataloguing and, in some cases, surgically removing alleged subcutaneous foreign bodies from witnesses, documented marks that exhibited one unusual property. The surrounding tissue showed no inflammatory response, no bruising in the layers beneath the skin, no white cell mobilization visible in the biopsied samples. Anyone who has sustained a bruise or puncture wound through ordinary means knows that the body responds immediately and visibly at the cellular level. These did not. Here's the strangest part. In independent case studies conducted by the Fund for UFO Research in the 1990s, witnesses photographed these marks immediately upon discovery. In a statistically significant number of cases, the marks had vanished completely within 48 to 72 hours. Not healed in the ordinary sense, not faded the way a bruise fades through the purpling, the yellowing, the gradual resolution of broken capillaries. Gone, as though they had never been there. I put this to a dermatologist I know, a professor at a major research hospital, who asked not to be named. She said the resolution pattern I described was, in her clinical experience, not consistent with any standard mechanism of tissue repair, not inflammation, not trauma, not dermatological disease. Then what? If there's a single thread that runs through every category of reported contact, every cultural variation, every era, every geography, it is this: the time is gone. Not a minute or two of mental fog upon waking. Not the ordinary morning confusion of a heavy sleeper, an hour, 2 hours, sometimes longer, a period of time that cannot be accounted for by the witness by any external record, and in several documented cases, by physical observation of the person by others in the same house who confirm they did not leave the room. The 1961 case of Barney and Betty Hill, investigated by the United States Air Force and documented by journalist John Fuller in The Interrupted Journey, involved a 2-hour gap during a drive from Niagara Falls to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The Hills had no explanation. They arrived home late. They were exhausted in a way neither could account for. Betty Hill's dress was torn at specific seams. Barney Hill's shoes were scraped across the tops. Their watches, both of them, had stopped. Both watches. In Brazil, in 1979, rural farmer Antonio Carlos Ferreira reported a 90-minute gap while walking between 2 villages on a path he had walked hundreds of times. His family confirmed he had left at a specific time. He arrived 90 minutes later than physically possible, given the distance. He had no memory of that period. His clothing, when examined, showed trace amounts of a substance that local university analysis described as unidentifiable, not a compound present in the soil, vegetation, or water sources along his route. The official explanation breaks here. Sleep doesn't cause missing time in people who are awake and moving. Amnesia doesn't operate with this precision or this geographic consistency. If you're finding this investigation worth your time, and I think you will, especially for what comes next, consider subscribing. What I'm about to show you in the next 5 signs is where the physical evidence stops being anecdotal and starts being something else entirely. I need to address the sleep paralysis argument directly because it is the most frequently deployed dismissal and it deserves a proper examination. Sleep paralysis is real. It is a documented neurological phenomenon in which the brain's motor inhibition system, which normally prevents the body from physically enacting dreams, fails to disengage at the moment of waking. The result is a period of consciousness in which the individual cannot move. It is often accompanied by hypnagogic hallucination, vivid sensory experiences generated by the transitioning brain. I accept all of this. Here's what sleep paralysis does not explain. Sleep paralysis is experienced alone. The paralysis in question, the one that appears consistently across contact reports, is experienced in multiple people in the same room simultaneously. There are documented cases from the United Kingdom, from France, from rural Japan, in which two people sharing a bedroom report the identical experience of waking, finding themselves unable to move, experiencing the presence of the same described entities, and regaining mobility at the same moment, simultaneously. Two separate brains, two separate nervous systems, two separate neurological events occurring in precise synchrony. The Allagash abduction of 1976 involved four individuals, Jack Weiner, Jim Weiner, Charlie Foltz, and Chuck Rack, who independently reported years apart and under separate hypnotic regression with separate investigators near identical accounts of paralysis and examination occurring on the same night. Four men, same event, same description, same timeline. But the sleep paralysis argument cannot accommodate simultaneous paralysis across multiple conscious individuals, not even close. This is where the medical record becomes difficult to look away from. Unexplained nosebleeds upon waking, specifically from the right nostril, specifically single incident rather than recurring, appear in the case files with a frequency that researchers have flagged as statistically anomalous. In isolation, a nosebleed is unremarkable. The nasal passages are vascular. They dry out. They bleed. I know this. You know this. But paired with what comes next, the nosebleed takes on a different weight. In the 1990s, surgeon Roger Lear performed surgery on patients who had reported contact experiences and who also reported, often years after the initial event, a localized sensation, a small hardness, a subtle awareness at a point below the skin, usually in the hand, the foot, or the nasal cavity. He removed objects, dozens of them. Some were identified as fragments of common materials, meteorite composition, biological crystalline structures, metal alloys, and some were not identified at all. Because here is where the evidence suggests something much larger than individual hallucination. The objects removed from multiple patients in different states, different countries, different decades of life showed the same isotopic ratios. The same ratios. An isotopic ratio is essentially an atomic fingerprint, the proportion of elemental isotopes in a given sample. Natural variation in terrestrial materials makes matching isotopic ratios across multiple independent samples extraordinarily improbable. Lab analysis conducted at Los Alamos National Scientific Laboratory, as documented in the peer-reviewed Journal of Scientific Exploration, confirmed the presence of isotopic ratios not consistent with terrestrial origin in several of the retrieved samples. Not terrestrial origin. Terrestrial materials, whether natural or manufactured, draw from the same pool of elements found on Earth. These did not match that pool. I am asking the question, not making the claim, but I am asking it loudly. If these objects are terrestrial, where did they come from? If they're not, what does that mean for the nosebleeds, for the right nostril, for the dozens of people across decades who never shared notes but arrived independently at the same anatomical location? Ask a witness about their experience, and a significant majority will initially call it a dream. This is the first and most natural defense the mind constructs. We have a category for vivid, frightening nocturnal experiences. We call them nightmares. We call them night terrors. We fold them into the familiar and we move on. But the dreams reported by contact witnesses share a set of characteristics that distinguish them sharply from ordinary dream experience and from nightmare experience in ways that have been measured. First, the affect is wrong. Dreams, even terrifying ones, carry a quality of unreality that most dreamers can retrospectively identify. Contact experiences are described universally with the language of hyperreality. Not "it felt real," but "it was more real than real." A phrase that appears so consistently across independent testimony that researchers have coined a specific term for it, the hyper-real quality of the experience. Second, the physical continuity. Dreams do not leave marks. Dreams do not leave the body exhausted in a specific asymmetric way. Dreams do not produce the physiological stress response, elevated cortisol, disrupted adrenal function that has been measured in witnesses for days following their experiences. A 1994 study published in the Journal of Traumatology found that contact witnesses showed PTSD markers at levels statistically indistinguishable from combat veterans and rape survivors. Not nightmare survivors, not sleep disorder patients, trauma survivors. Third, the content. If these are dreams, they are dreams drawing from an extraordinarily narrow and consistent source. The examination table, the circular room, the instruments, the large black eyes, the communication without language, received directly, internally, as though words were placed rather than spoken. These elements appear in the testimony of a Brazilian farmer in 1957, an English housewife in 1974, an American military veteran in 1988, and a Japanese teenager in 2003. They have never met. They did not share their accounts, and yet they describe the same room. What you're watching is not a collection of isolated incidents. This is a pattern, and patterns in any investigative methodology mean something is directing them. Stay with me, because the next sign is where the coordination problem becomes impossible to sidestep. Electronics fail. This seems trivial until you map it. In the hours before, during, and in some cases after reported nocturnal contact events, witnesses document a consistent suite of electronic anomalies. Clocks stop, and not in the poetic sense, literally stop. Digital displays going dark, or analog hands halting at specific times. Mobile phones lose charge completely despite having been fully charged before sleep. Household circuits trip for no identifiable electrical reason. Recorded video footage from security cameras, this is the 21st century. Many of these witnesses have cameras, shows interruption, not deletion, not corruption, a clean interruption. Recording stops, recording resumes. The interval corresponds to the missing time. A woman in Wiltshire, England, in 2009 had installed a security camera system after a previous experience she couldn't account for. She recorded for 3 months without interruption her driveway, her garden, her bedroom door. On the night of her second reported experience, all 4 cameras cut simultaneously at 3:04 a.m. and resumed at 4:47 a.m. The footage shows her door closed, then 93 minutes of nothing, then her door still closed. The power was not interrupted. The recording system's internal clock shows continuous operation. The cameras simply produced no data for that window of time. I put this to an electronics engineer. He said the most likely explanation was a power surge or brief outage. I told him the power was on. He said a localized magnetic disturbance could interfere with recording heads. I asked him what would generate a localized magnetic disturbance of that intensity. He said industrial machinery, certain military equipment, or he paused. I don't know, he said. I'd have to see the system. He never saw the system. That pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The experts acknowledge the anomaly, reach the edge of their framework, and stop. This one is harder to quantify, and perhaps for that reason, it may be the most compelling. People who report contact experiences change, not gradually, not in the ways that therapy changes people or grief or time abruptly. In specific, documented directions, heightened sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, a real measurable phenomenon in which affected individuals experience physical symptoms near power lines, near certain electronic equipment, in ways that can be reproduced under control conditions. Researchers at the University of Nevada documented this in a cohort of contact witnesses in the mid-1990s. The sensitivity was confirmed through blind testing. It was not psychosomatic. The witnesses' nervous systems were responding to fields that the control subjects did not register. Changes in visual perception, specifically a reported sensitivity to frequencies at the edges of the visible spectrum. Several witnesses report post-contact the ability to perceive ultraviolet light to a degree outside normal human range. Optometric testing in at least 3 documented cases confirmed anomalous photoreceptor response that was not present in earlier medical records. Changes in intuition, which is difficult to quantify but has been approached. Studies of contact witnesses show elevated performance on certain types of pattern recognition and anomaly detection tasks. Not across the board, not on intelligence metrics, specifically on tests designed to measure the detection of embedded patterns in complex data and changes in knowledge. Witnesses reporting post-contact an understanding of concepts, mathematical, physical, biological, that they cannot account for educationally. Betty Hill's star map, drawn from memory following her 1961 experience and dismissed for a decade, was later analysed by schoolteacher and amateur astronomer Marjorie Fish, who identified it as an accurate representation of the Zeta Reticuli binary system, a system that, at the time of Hill's drawing, had not been catalogued in publicly available astronomical data. Betty Hill was not an astronomer. The accuracy of that map is not disputed. Here is where I want to slow down and sit with something uncomfortable. Among the approximately 62,000 documented cases I referenced at the opening of this investigation, a significant proportion involved people who never told anyone, who carried the experience alone for years, sometimes decades, who only came forward after stumbling across in a support group or a late-night radio call-in or an internet forum someone else who said, and the language is almost always identical, "The same thing happened to me." The silence is not defensive. It's not the silence of someone hiding something they did. It's the silence of someone who knows with absolute certainty that they will not be believed. And that knowing is so complete, so thorough, so consistent across the thousands of witnesses from disparate cultures and educational backgrounds that it itself becomes a data point. Because where does that certainty come from? We don't self-censor ordinary trauma with that completeness. People discuss car accidents, violent crimes, medical trauma, paranormal encounters of other kinds. There is a specific quality to contact experience silence that researchers have described as imposed, not chosen, but placed. Dr. John Mack, Pulitzer Prize-winning psychiatrist and professor at Harvard Medical School, spent the latter part of his career studying exactly this phenomenon. He was not a credulous man. He was one of the most rigorous psychological minds of his generation. He concluded, not tentatively, not hedging, that the experiences his witnesses described did not fit any existing psychological model for confabulation, fantasy, or mental illness. That the consistency of the testimony, the physical corroboration, and the psychological after effects were evidence of something genuinely anomalous. Harvard did not thank him for this. The institutional silence that followed, the withdrawal of funding, the quiet editorial closures, the academic distancing, mirrored in its own way the silence of the witnesses themselves. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The 10th sign is the one most contact witnesses name last, not because it's the least significant, but because it is the hardest to describe, the most easily dismissed, and the one they are most afraid of. A knowing, not a suspicion, not a lingering unease from a disturbing dream. A knowing, a sense of information received that cannot be sourced to any sensory input, any prior knowledge, any ordinary process of inference or deduction. Witnesses describe knowing upon waking immediately, with a clarity that does not diminish in daylight, that they were not alone, that they have been observed over a long period of time, that the visitation was not random, that they were, for reasons they cannot articulate and were not given, selected. I want to be careful with this one. The experience of certainty is not evidence. People experience certainty about things that are wrong. I know this, but consider the accompanying data. The marks, the implants, the electromagnetic disruption, the synchronized paralysis, the missing time, the physiological trauma response, the isotopic anomalies. These are not feelings. These are measurable. These are documented, and those documented physical realities coexist in case after case with this one final sign, the knowing that it was not random. That raises a question I cannot answer. If it was not random, if these tens of thousands of people across continents and centuries were selected by something, then selection implies purpose. And purpose implies intelligence. And intelligence of this kind implies technology and intention so far beyond our current framework that we do not have the instruments to measure it, the language to describe it, or the institutional structures to respond to it. What do you do with that? Let me tell you what exists and what doesn't. What exists? The Roper poll data, intact and publicly available. The Journal of Scientific Exploration papers documenting the isotopic analysis. John Fuller's book and the supporting Air Force documentation of the Hill case. Dr. Mack's case files donated to Harvard's Schlesinger Library following his death, where they sit today largely unexamined by mainstream academic inquiry. What doesn't exist? Any coordinated institutional response to the pattern. That absence is its own evidence. Consider how institutions respond to epidemiological patterns. When cases of an unknown illness begin clustering geographically, the response is systematic, rapid, and well-resourced. Case files are centralized, researchers are coordinated, databases are built and cross-referenced. The machinery of pattern recognition is deployed almost immediately. Now ask yourself, where is that machinery for this? 62,000 documented cases, physical evidence, medical anomalies confirmed in laboratory settings, and no coordinated institutional investigation. Not from the medical community, not from the psychiatric establishment, not from government bodies, despite the well-documented and now partially declassified interest of agencies within the United States military intelligence apparatus. The Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATIP, operated within the Department of Defense for years before its existence was confirmed. Its mandate, as described by former Director Luis Elizondo in congressional testimony, included the investigation of not just aerial phenomena, but their potential interaction with human beings on the ground. The documentation of that program, the full case files, the medical reports, the witness interviews, the vast majority remain classified, not archived, not peer-reviewed, not published, classified. This is where the narrative we are offered, the comfortable narrative of sleep disorders and mass delusion, begins to crack at its foundations. Because classified implies something to protect. Classified implies knowledge. And knowledge, in this context, implies investigation. And investigation implies that somewhere, in a building with no public address and a budget line that doesn't appear in any public ledger, someone has been taking this seriously for a very long time. And they haven't told us. I want to ask you to do something. I want you to imagine the alternative explanation, the one that doesn't involve extraterrestrial entities. Let's say every single one of these 62,000 documented cases is a product of the human mind. Let's say the paralysis is sleep paralysis, the marks are self-inflicted under hypnagogic dissociation, the missing time is temporal distortion under extreme stress, the implants are terrestrial contamination, the electromagnetic disturbances are coincidental technical failures, and the synchronized experiences of multiple witnesses are collaborative confabulation. Let's say all of that. Then explain the consistency. Not the broad strokes, not the general shape of alien beings and examination tables, which could theoretically be attributed to cultural contamination through science fiction. I mean the specifics. The right nostril, the 3 a.m. onset window, the triangular bruise configuration, the identical isotopic ratios across samples from 3 continents, the specific star system in Betty Hill's map. Cultural contamination cannot explain the 8th century Japanese scroll painting depicting small grey figures standing beside a sleeping figure, documented in the Tokyo National Museum collection, predating Roswell by 1100 years. Cultural contamination cannot explain the identical entity descriptions recorded by Dominican priests during the 16th century colonial mission in what is now Peru, descriptions locked in church archives and not translated into English until the 1980s, decades after the first modern contact reports. This is the coordination problem. If this is not real, then the human mind across every culture, every century, every language, every belief system has been independently generating the same specific, detailed, physically corroborating hallucination. Not cultural contamination, not shared mythology, not the universal architecture of human dreaming, but the same right nostril, the same triangular configuration, the same 3 a.m. That coordination problem does not have an innocent solution. Either the human mind contains something that generates this experience from a common internal source, which would be the most extraordinary discovery in the history of neuroscience, and would itself demand urgent investigation, or the source is external, consistent, intentional. And the further I went down this path, the more the second option became not the extraordinary claim, but the parsimonious one. I need to tell you about what happens to the evidence, not in every case. I want to be precise. But in a statistically significant subset of high-quality documented cases, the physical evidence, the implants, the photography, the medical records, the independently verified laboratory analyses, goes away. Lear's surgical specimens, several are now unaccounted for. The chain of custody breaks at points that cannot be explained by administrative error alone. The Rendlesham Forest incident of 1980, involving United States Air Force personnel at a joint UK-US base in Suffolk, England, generated contemporaneous written reports, physical ground impressions, radiation readings documented by a Geiger counter, and audio recordings of the event as it unfolded. The radiation readings were confirmed by the British Ministry of Defence. The audio recording made by the Deputy Base Commander exists and has been authenticated. Taken A, the official USAF documentation acknowledges the incident. The follow-up investigation, there wasn't one. The ground impressions photographed, documented, and then the site was cleared. The radiation levels measured, recorded, and then the records were not made available under the initial Freedom of Information requests, appearing only years later in partially redacted form. The colonel who submitted the original report, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, has been publicly clear for decades. He was told in the days following the incident to treat it as closed, not investigated, not explained, closed. That's not how anomalous events are handled in any institutional framework I'm familiar with. The silence was deafening and deliberate, and it points towards something that the official record is explicitly designed to prevent you from finding. Here is a number I keep returning to. In 1987, Bud Hopkins, artist, researcher, author, placed a 1-paragraph notice in a small alternative publication requesting that anyone who had experienced an unexplained nocturnal event contact him. He received over 2,000 letters. 2,000 from a single paragraph notice in a small circulation publication. Before the internet, he spent the rest of his life cataloguing those accounts. He found the same marks, the same times, the same entities, the same descriptions of a room, a table, instruments, and large dark eyes that communicated without sound. 2,000 people, no shared prior contact, no coordinated storytelling, no network of mutual reinforcement, all describing the same room. What is the probability, purely as a statistical question, setting aside every metaphysical implication, that 2,000 independently sourced witnesses with no mechanism of coordination would describe the same specific physical environment, the same entities, the same procedures, with this degree of convergence? I've asked statisticians that question. They don't answer it directly, and they redirect to methodology, they redirect to sampling bias, they redirect to the replication crisis in social science research. They don't answer the question. Because the honest mathematical answer is the probability is vanishingly small, the kind of small that in any other domain of inquiry would be treated as confirmation. I started by asking whether something is happening. I no longer think that's the right question. The evidence argues with uncomfortable force that something is happening, has been happening. Across 62,000 documented cases and an unknowable number of undocumented ones, across centuries, across the full breadth of human geography and human consciousness. The question I've been sitting with, alone, at a desk covered in case files and laboratory reports and declassified documents and the private testimonies of people who, in many cases, wept when they told me their stories, is not whether it's happening. The question is what it wants. Because if the pattern is real, and I believe the evidence compels us to treat it as real, then the pattern is not random. It is not chaotic. It is not the byproduct of some impersonal physical force operating without direction. It is directed. 10,000 years of directed attention on a species that has spent most of its history not even believing in the possibility of other intelligent life in the universe. Attention that leaves marks, that retrieves something, that alters the people it touches, that is systematic enough to operate globally, precise enough to use the same nostril, intelligent enough to neutralize recording equipment, and careful enough, or perhaps strategic enough, to remain, despite all of this, deniable. Why deniable? That's the question that keeps me up at night. Not the question of who they are, not where they come from, not the technological mystery of an intelligence capable of traversing whatever distance separates its origin from our bedrooms, not those. Why, in 62,000 documented cases, has not a single event been allowed to cross the threshold from compelling but deniable to confirmed? Why, every time the evidence begins to accumulate toward that threshold, a surgical specimen, a classified document, a base commander's written report, does something intervene? What precisely is being maintained? The evidence suggests something much larger than a phenomenon. It suggests a policy, not ours. There is a Brazilian witness I spoke to near the end of my investigation, a farmer, 70s, educated but not academically. He described his experience with a simplicity and a stillness that I found more disturbing than any of the dramatic testimony I'd encountered. He told me he woke one night, found himself unable to move, and understood, not through any communication he could describe, but with the complete certainty I discussed in Sign 10, that he was not the first in his family this had happened to. That it had happened to his father, that it had happened to his grandfather before that. That whatever was happening, it was not new. I asked him if he was afraid. He thought about it for a long time. Not afraid, he said. But I understand now that there is a door in this world that I didn't know existed. And once you know about the door, you cannot pretend it isn't there. I've thought about that a great deal, because what he described, the generational continuity, the inherited pattern, the door in the world, is either the most elaborate and consistent collective psychological phenomenon in human history, sustained across cultures and bloodlines without any mechanism of transmission, or it is evidence of something that has been watching us specifically and intentionally for longer than we have records to measure. I don't know which of those is more terrifying. I don't know which of those is more wondrous. What I know is that the official account, the one that assigns all of this to sleep neurology and social psychology and mass suggestibility, does not hold. It does not hold in the laboratory. It does not hold in the case files. It does not hold when you sit across from someone whose eyes carry the specific quality of a person who has seen something the rest of us haven't. and who is neither lying nor mad, and who simply quietly tells you that something came for them in the night and left marks they couldn't explain, and took time they couldn't account for and changed them in ways they're still mapping. It does not hold, and I am left at the end of 2 years of investigation, where every honest inquiry into this subject eventually arrives, not with an answer, but with a question so large and so patient and so old that it feels less like something I'm asking and more like something that has always been asking me. What are we to these things? And what exactly are they building toward? The door is there. You've always known about the door. You just didn't know what was on the other side. Neither do I, yet.